For more on this, criminal defense attorney Sara Azari joins me now. You're a defense attorney, as we just mentioned. I noticed one of your tweets, and I'm going to read it out for you. I know you wrote it, but it says, "Happy to see a hashtag I created in 2017 has picked up momentum. Hashtag men too. Hashtag Johnny Depp." First, I have to ask you, those billboards that I happen to see popping up alongside the roadsides, are those yours?
No, Sarah, but I'm glad to see that my fans are taking a step towards making this bigger. When I started this, when I wrote about this Men Too thing on Twitter years ago, it was early on in the Me Too movement, but I just could see where this was headed, and I could see the one-sidedness, and I could see the absolute dangers both in and out of court, and they've all come to be true. And so to me, this trial is so much bigger. Speaking of the big picture, it's so much bigger than Johnny Depp, than a celebrity, than this chaotic, toxic relationship, or even the issue of domestic violence. It goes to show you that, we're absolutely misogynistic in our understanding of, who perpetrators are, who violent offenders are. They're not just men. They're also women. The idea of, being so unfair and one-sided, I'm not a woman hater. I grew up with very strong women, not men. But I think to get equality and to really get out of this movement what it's intended to do, we also need ownership, and with ownership comes truth. And so for me, the Depp trial is so significant because he is probably the first guy since the Me Too movement sort of spearheaded in 2017 to come forward and defend himself, not once but twice, Sarah, right? He did it in the UK, he lost, and he did it again in Virginia, and it's all over these allegations of domestic abuse that he wholeheartedly believes are false accusations. So it's really, really significant that this is not the typical guy, this is not the typical scenario. He is standing up for his truth, which may or may not be the truth. The truth is up to the jury, of course.
Sarah, let me ask you about this, because you just mentioned it. Your tweet indicates that you've sort of sided with Depp, and you're a criminal defense attorney. But in 2020, he did lose his libel case over accusations of violence against her in Britain. Depp had sued not her, but a British tabloid who claimed that he was a wife beater in print. And he lost the case because the British judge ruled that his then wife Heard was the victim of sustained and multiple assaults by Mr. Depp. And as you know, the truth is a sufficient defense to libel. So does this give any insight into what may happen in this defamation case that is happening here in the United States that he's bringing against Amber Heard? Can that case even be brought in by the defense?
No, that was a case under UK law. It was brought before one arbiter, a judge. Typically, as you know, we don't go to trial before a judge. We have the option to do that, but we go with a jury because you have, 12 independent-minded people from different walks of life deciding the evidence and deciding the verdict. And, while there might be some overlap in the evidence that's presented, it's a whole different ballgame. He was suing the son. Here he's suing her directly. There was no First Amendment in the UK. We have a First Amendment here. There was no requirement that he show actual malice in the UK, or here he has to show actual malice. And also in the US, the burden lies with the plaintiff, not with the defendant. In the UK case, the defense, the son, had to prove the truth of, I guess they use the term wife beater in an article. They had to prove the truth. So, I think it was, again, one guy deciding whether this happened or not and whether he is a wife beater. I don't think that carries much weight in a U.S. courtroom.
Okay, so you just heard, and our audience heard the latest from Jean Casares. Johnny Depp accused Heard of being the abuser during this trial. And there was some audio played where she admits in the audio that she hit him. And she says, yes, I hit you, I didn't punch you. And there was a whole back and forth there. How important is this piece of evidence to the jury?
It's so significant, Sarah, because remember, this is an op-ed that she wrote, and what she selectively picked facts that fit her victim profile. I mean, if this was a relationship, it sounds like it is, of mutual combat, of many instances where she was the perpetrator, not just the victim, writing an op-ed where you're just saying, you're the victim of domestic violence and how you've taken the wrath, etc. Well, that's really disingenuous, and that is false, and that is defamatory. And so I think it was a huge piece of evidence that changed the trajectory of this trial and really what we've known about this relationship so far. And and also it can be used in the proof of actual malice, that she knew that she was the perpetrator in at least some of these instances. And in fact, a psychologist testified that he was the one of the two who was always de-escalating, and she was the one that was sort of hot-tongued and really rash and aggressive. So these are not good facts for her, writing an op-ed as a victim.
Depp has also claimed, and this is part of why the defamation case has been brought, that he's lost work because of these allegations. I want you to hear some of what he said after a previous legal battle with Heard. Okay, so he says this: "It's so far out of hand now that I can promise you that no one is safe. Not one of you. Not one out there. It takes one sentence and there's no more ground. The carpet has been pulled. It's just me that this has happened to. It's happened to a lot of people. This type of thing has happened to women and men." Is this what you're talking about resonating in the court of public opinion? Because Me Too brought up some very important issues as well, that for so long women had not been believed, and when they were believed, or when they brought it to the fore, brought it to the public, made a complaint, they were then victimized again. Is he basically turning this on its head, and is it resonating?
I think it is resonating, Sarah, and I think the idea here is, maybe he didn't put it in the most politically correct fashion, but I think the idea here is that, fine, come forward, be heard, be loud, be clear. But where is the proof, right? I represent individuals accused of Me Too conduct, both in and out of court. In court, you have a constitution that applies. You have due process rights, which are pretty much eviscerated by this movement. Out of court, you don't have that. So, you're fair game, and it's about fairness. And so my point is, we'll believe you, we'll hear you, right? But let's stick to the truth. Let's not dilute this movement, which is very important to all of us women, but let's not dilute it. Let's stick to the truth. Let's own our own conduct. Let's own our truth, and then this movement will survive and thrive. That's the problem. And so as this trial continues, and if it turns out that these allegations were largely false, I mean, this is a perfect example of what happens when someone comes forward and you just believe them.
So Amber Heard has echoed the accusations that we've talked about in Me Too, that for decades, women were victimized, then they talked about it, then they got punished again. She is now countersuing for $100 million, saying that she was defamed. What do you see happening with this chapter of the case going forward?
Sarah, I think that chapter is going to turn on this chapter, right? On Depp's underlying suit against her for defamation, because it's like, who defamed who lied about what, and who's the liar. And so if it turns out that Depp is, if he prevails in this lawsuit, and it turns out that Amber Heard's allegations have been false, then she's going to have a hard time going after him and saying that him calling her a liar is false and defamatory. So I think that is really going to turn, that's why it's a countersuit. That's going to turn on what happens in this lawsuit. But what's not going to turn on what happens in this lawsuit is his ability to regain his credibility, his reputation, and maybe rekindle with Hollywood. Because Hollywood, as you know, likes a good comeback story. And Hollywood doesn't care about the legalities of the money judgment and whether you prevail or not in a lawsuit. Hollywood wanted to hear what he's been testifying to for the last 2 days. So vulnerably, so calmly, and incredibly credibly. So
let me ask you this. You brought up the issue of mutual abuse. And explain to me if there is something in the law that looks at that. In other words, if, for example, this is an exaggeration, but you hit someone with a feather and they hit you with a bat. Like, is there something in the law that says it has to be proportional? It has to be self-defense? Yeah. How does this play out?
Yeah, so, when you have a situation of a battery, and domestic violence is a battery, it's just between domestic partners, girlfriends, boyfriends, wives, husbands, etc. And so when you have domestic violence and you're looking at this case, you have to look for the first aggressor, number one. Who started this? Because the person that started this cannot claim that they're a victim, right? Who's the instigator? And second, you have to look at whether the force was proportional to the force that was used. So in your case, the feather with the bat, no, that's not going to fly. But the force has to be proportional to the force used. I mean, we see this in the officer cases that we talk about all the time, and the force that they use, whether it's reasonable or not. And the same applies here.
Well, you talked about the fact that you have defended both men and women who have been accused in these kinds of cases. Are there any parallels that you're seeing with this case and the clients that you've represented in the past? Is that why this is sort of catching on with people?
Yeah, I just think that we are programmed as a society as a whole to think of men as the wrongdoers. And yeah, statistically, they tend to be the violent offenders. But there are women who also abuse substances. There are women who also are violent for other reasons, not because of substance abuse, but just in general. And, in the cases that I've had where I've represented women who've been accused, and some of them convicted, sadly, they were not a battered woman. They were the batterer. They were the vandal. They were the beater. And so we have to start opening up our minds to the idea that, just because, especially if we want this movement to be empowering and move forward, we're not always the victim. We're not. That's just a fact. And so that's why this resonates with me, because I've had it in my own practice and in real life,
Defense attorney Sara Azari, we appreciate your time. Thank you for being on Big Picture.
Thanks, my friend.